class. Welcome back to history. Now, the last time we did history, we were talking about the country of Japan. And you were able to read the notes that I sent you. And you got to read about Commodore Matthew Perry and how he opened up trade in Japan. And hopefully also you got to see some pictures of that. And you read about Pearl Harbor and how Japan drew the United States into World War II. By bombing our naval base there in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. And then you learned a little bit about our involvement with World War II and how it related to Japan, since that's the country we're talking about. And so we also talked about the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and also on Nagasaki, and how that kind of ended the war there in Japan, and then how relations and things changed in Japan since that time. And so today we are going to keep going in Asia, except for now we're going to talk about the countries of Southeast Asia. So we're going to talk a little bit about them. We're going to mostly focus on the country of Vietnam, but we'll also look at some of the other countries there too, kind of see where they are on the map, and talk a little bit about their history and how they came to be where they are today. Okay, so let's look over here on my whiteboard. I have a list of the countries we're going to talk about today in Southeast Asia, and you can see right off the bat that we have them listed underneath in different colors so you can see them better. We have Myanmar. This country used to be called Burma, but now it's called Myanmar. We have Thailand. And then we also have Laos, this country right here. We have Cambodia. We have Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Okay, and these last ones that we talked about, starting with Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines, those are all island nations. And so we'll be talking about them. But the first ones I want to talk about that we will see here are, we're going to talk about the ones that I have circled on the board here. So you see we have Laos circled and Cambodia circled, and also Vietnam. And we're going to talk about those first because when those countries were first settled, they were known as French Indochina. So you can imagine with the word French there, that's because the French were the ones that kind of conquered that land and took it over, and they controlled it. And they controlled these three countries for quite a long period of time until they decided they were going to give up their colonies there. And so these countries of Laos, or they really weren't countries at that point, they were colonies, but Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, they weren't really ready for independence. They didn't really know how to be a country or to run. So as soon as the French left these countries were left open and really opened up for communist aggression. So the communist countries. Now, if you remember, when we've been talking about these other countries, there are some pretty big communist countries that are really close to these, to the ones that we're talking about today. Let's look at a map so we can see where these countries are. All right, let me make sure we don't have a glare on there. All right, so when you're looking at this map here, you can see the very big country right here of China. Remember that China is communist. And then all the way up here in this green area up here was where the USSR was. Now, that's no longer called the USSR. We have Russia and a bunch of other smaller countries that formed later. But at that time, the time we're going to be talking about, this area all up in here was communist. And so you see we have two very large countries that are communist that are just itching to get their hands on these smaller countries. So I'm going to move this a little closer so you can see it even better. So the ones that we're talking about here, Laos is this little yellow country right here. And then right underneath Laos is this little green country called Cambodia. And then kind of running along the side of it, this purple country here is called Vietnam. So you can see how close these countries are to China. And here's where we get to Vietnam right here. Now, what happened was, as the French left these colonies and they kind of left them to their own devices, communism kind of moved in and it took over the northern part of Vietnam. Just like we talked about with Korea, the same exact thing happened to Vietnam. Over here, I drew a picture there of, or a little map here of Vietnam. And so there's North Vietnam, communist, and then Southern Vietnam, who was trying to stay a free republic. And then Laos and Cambodia, they ended up becoming constitutional monarchies at the time. Okay. And remember that Cambodia is right down here. I'll put a C there for that. And then Laos is right up here. Okay. So this is a communist country right here. This part, the north part, is communist. I'll put that right here so we can see that. Oh, you can't see those words. Ta-da. There we go. Okay. The communist country right here. And then South Vietnam was free. But obviously, just like in Korea, the communists were not satisfied with only having half of the country of Vietnam. They wanted all of Vietnam. And so as soon as they could, they started leading attacks here on South Vietnam. And this led to what we call the Vietnam War. Again, when we talked about Korea, we talked about the Korean War. And this is the same thing we're talking about as the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was a very long war. And it all involved the communist countries, these communists here who were getting help from China and the USSR, the Soviet Union. They were getting help from them. And South Vietnam was really struggling. It's obviously a very small little country there. So in 1955, South Vietnam asked America, or the United States, would you please help us fight these communist threats to our country? And they requested, could we please have American troops come so that we can defend our country from communism? So in 1957, the president at that time of the United States, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, he sent military trainers. So instead of sending troops, he sent people that would train the South Vietnamese armies so that they could defend themselves. And for a while, that seemed to be working okay. But now the communist country of North Vietnam started getting help from both the Soviet Union and communist China, and they were helping in the 1960s. And at that time, our president of the United States was President John F. Kennedy. And so John F. Kennedy began to send in American soldiers to help them. So now we didn't just train them. Now we were sending actual soldiers from our country to help free the Vietnamese. And then the next president after Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson, he sent almost 500,000 Americans over to try to help South Vietnam fight back against the communists. Now, what they should have done was they should have invaded North Vietnam. That would have been the right thing to do. If you can see, if we came in and we helped them, I mean, they came up through here and we attacked North Vietnam and we invaded them, that war could be over pretty quickly and we would have preserved the freedom of Southeast Asia and all these other countries that are around this. But unfortunately, there were many Americans that convinced the government leaders that we just would not be able to win this Vietnam War. And instead, let's just let the communists take this little country. This is what they would say. They said, if we just let the communists here in North Vietnam take South Vietnam, it's not really that big of a deal. It's not that big of a country. And if we stay there, it's just going to be this really long war and we're not going to win it anyway. So we should just pull out. And then to sweeten the deal, communist China told the United States, hey, if you pull your soldiers out of there, and if you pull your soldiers out of Taiwan, which is a little island right off the coast of China, then we will trade goods. We'll buy goods from you and trade goods with you if you do these things. So now the United States had another incentive to pull out of Vietnam. And then Congress thought, well, if we actually pull out of Vietnam, we might actually have better relations with the Soviet Union. And things were kind of tense with the Soviet Union at that time. We were going through what we call the Cold War and with the communists. And they thought, well, this will be great. We'll have good relations with China, a communist country. We'll have good relations with the Soviet Union, another communist country. And then we'll just pull our troops. And also we'll have all these, trade benefits too if we just pull our troops out of Vietnam. So when Richard Nixon became our president, that was in 1968, he made the decision to take the American troops from South Vietnam. And then our Congress, the Congress of the United States, recognized the communist government of China and kind of favored it over the nationalist Chinese government of Taiwan. And let me show you real quick where Taiwan is too, so you know what I'm talking about when I say that. So in our little map here again, right here is China, and right off to the coast right here, that little island right there is Taiwan. And Taiwan was a free country, and China is communist. But then, of course, United States was trying to make deals with communist China, which hasn't changed much to this day. And then little Taiwan was left out of the picture. And they pulled their troops right out of Vietnam. And of course, as you can imagine, when they pulled their troops out of Vietnam, then South Vietnam fell to the communist governments. And then guess what? Because you guys already know this, the communists weren't going to be satisfied. They came down here and they invaded this. And now they controlled all of Vietnam. And so the very next country that they decided to come to was Cambodia. And they took over Cambodia. And then they took over Laos. And they didn't just take them over and start running them with a regular government, but it was really a reign of terror. Millions of Cambodians and people from Laos and from Vietnam were murdered, and more than 1 million Vietnamese people fled the country on these makeshift rafts and boats and barges. We call them the boat people, and a lot of them didn't even make it anywhere. They just died on the seas because they just didn't have enough. Their boats weren't safe enough to get them anywhere, or they didn't have enough supplies. But the ones that were able to make it to the United States and to Canada were able to get refuge there. But everybody that stayed behind, that were not murdered or tried to flee the country, were made slaves of the communist states. And they lost all their freedoms, and they had to work for these state farms and factories that were just really inefficient. And they were basically just designed just for them to keep working at a slave level. Since that time, the United States obviously didn't have a very good relationship with Vietnam because we left them in their time of need. But since that time, we have tried to, normalize and get a better relationship with Vietnam. And back in 2000, our President Bill Clinton went over there and visited Vietnam. So that was a big deal there, and tried to establish some business ties and things like that would help with those things. So that's our story of Vietnam. Now, another country that we'll see on our list of countries here is Thailand. This guy right here. I love Thai food. But we're going to talk about the country of Thailand. Thailand used to be called Siam, and it's the only Southeast Asian country that has never been under the rule of a European country. So, which is pretty cool. The Thai people are very patriotic, and they work really hard, and they're right in this area right here. Okay. That's where Thailand is, here on this side. And they've worked very hard to make sure that their country does not get taken over by communist rule. Most people in Thailand worship Buddha and spirits. And the capital of Thailand, I'll write it right under here, is Bangkok. All right, and then we'll just want to talk about some of these other countries that I listed up on the board. I told you that the rest of these countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines, are all of our island countries. So let's look at those on the map really quickly. You can see here on our map. So here's where we had, here's Thailand right there. And this is all this peninsula right here, the Malaysian peninsula right here. And right above Thailand is that Myanmar. We're really not going to talk much about that country today. But then when you come down this little peninsula right here, you'll see this little pink country, Malaysia, which also extends onto this island, this big island right here we call the island of Burma. And then that little pink top right there is that little country called, or there's a little tiny blue country, you probably can't even see it. Maybe I'll hold up really close there. And that the country of Brunei there. Then all these purple islands in here, you can see lots of islands. That's Indonesia. And then our green islands over here, there are the Philippines. Okay, so those are the countries that we're talking about now, our island countries, all in this Southeast Asia that we're talking about. All right, so Malaysia is part of that Borneo that I was telling you about, which is the third largest island in the world. And Singapore, I don't think I showed you that one on the map, but Singapore, whose capital is also Singapore, is one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Brunei, that little tiny country I showed you in there, is rich in oil and natural gas. And so that's there on that big island of Borneo too. But the largest island in Southeast Asia, or the largest country in Southeast Asia, is Indonesia. Now, technically, it's a whole bunch of those little islands there in Indonesia. And then Indonesia was called the Spice Islands at that time, or even East Indies, because explorers would go over there and find all kinds of exotic spices and things that they could not get in the European countries at that time. And so that's what we call Indonesia there. And then the Philippines. The Philippines are the islands on the side. The capital of the Philippines is one that I want you to remember. So I'll write that right here. The capital of the Philippines is Manila. Looks just like that right there. The Spanish actually invaded and conquered the Philippines initially. And then in 1898, they gave the Philippines to the United States. And the United States actually moved in and helped those islands develop schools and a stable government. And then in 1946, they gave them their independence. So I'll put that date right here. And so the Philippines have been their own country, not run by any other country, since 1946. And that's really all we're going to say about these Southeast Asian countries. Now, I do want to show you this little map in our book that shows the world's 8 largest islands. Okay. And the biggest island you'll see is Greenland. Now, all the islands on our map here are marked in red. Okay. And you can see Greenland right up there on the top there. So Greenland. And then our second largest island is New Guinea, which we will talk about coming up soon, right here by Australia. The third largest island in the world is Borneo. We talked about that one today. That's the one that has Brunei on it and part of Malaysia, okay, and also Singapore. And then the fourth largest island is Madagascar. Madagascar is this island over here by the continent of Africa. And then we have number 5 is Baffin Island. That's in the Arctic Ocean, and that's up here by Greenland. And then we have Sumatra, that's in the Indian Ocean, right over here, really close to Borneo, and part of these island groups that are in Southeast Asia. Then we have Honshu, Japan. Remember that Japan is made up of a few islands there. And so right here, the biggest island that is the part of Japan there is called Honshu. And then we have number 8, which is Great Britain. And that's the island that England is on all the way over here. By Europe. And so these are the world's 8 largest islands. I think a lot of times when we think about islands, we think about, being stranded on a deserted island and it's just this little blip in the sea with just some sand and some palm trees. But there are actually some very big islands here that are shown here on this map. So you can see those there. All right. So that's what we will be talking about in history today. When you log off of this video, I'll tell you this. So when you log off of this video, then what I want you to do is I want you to look at the study page that I have also posted with the video on your Google Classroom page. And when you look at that study page, that's going to have all the important terms that I just talked about in history for you. And then what I want you to do with that is take that and be ready. Keep that page because then you're going to need that for our Wednesday assignment because I'm going to give you some questions and ask you to do some things regarding our Southeast Asia that we talked about today. And that's it for today's history lesson. So I will see you guys next time. Bye.